My HOA kept driving over my hedge every night, so I quietly reinforced it. The next time they tried it, their SUV didn't destroy the hedge. The hedge destroyed their car. The first time I heard the sound, I thought it was thunder rolling across the neighborhood. It was late, the kind of quiet night where even the wind seems to whisper instead of blow. I had just fallen asleep on the couch after a long day fixing engines at my shop when a sudden crunch snapped me awake. It wasn't a normal sound. It was heavy, violent, like something large had been crushed under weight. For a moment I sat there in the dark, listening to the silence that followed. Then I smelled it through the open window. The sharp scent of torn plants and hot rubber. My stomach tightened immediately. I pulled on my shoes and stepped outside onto my front porch. The streetlight down the road cast just enough yellow light for me to see the front of my yard. And that's when my chest sank. My hedge was destroyed. Not just bent or brushed aside. Completely flattened. 2 of the boxwood bushes I had planted years ago were crushed into the dirt. Branches snapped like dry sticks. Tire tracks cut straight through the soil, deep enough to tell me a heavy vehicle had driven right over them. Whoever did it didn't slow down either. They plowed straight through like the hedge wasn't even there. That hedge meant something to me. It wasn't some fancy landscaping project done by professionals. I planted it myself when I bought this house 8 years ago. Back then the yard was just a patch of dry grass and weeds. I spent weekends digging holes, setting the small shrubs in place, watering them every evening after work. Over time they grew into a clean green line that separated my little piece of peace from the road. It was simple, but it was mine. Standing there looking at the damage, I tried to convince myself it was probably an accident. Maybe a drunk driver missed the turn. Maybe someone unfamiliar with the road cut the corner too tight. Things happen. Still, something about the tracks bothered me. They were too straight, too deliberate. Whoever drove over that hedge didn't lose control. They aimed right at it. The next morning I called the HOA office just to report the damage. I expected at least a little concern. Instead, the woman on the phone sounded irritated, like I had interrupted her day. She told me that hedges, too close to the street, could create hazards and maybe I should consider moving them back a few feet. I stared at the phone in disbelief after she hung up. My hedge had been there for years without a single complaint. That's when the uneasy feelings started creeping in. Because deep down, something told me this wasn't just an accident. A few days after the hedge was destroyed, I fixed what I could. I straightened the branches that were completely broken, packed the loose soil back into place, and replaced 2 bushes that were too crushed to save. It took most of my Saturday afternoon, and by the time I finished, my hands were covered in dirt and small cuts from the branches. Still, I felt better looking at it standing again. Not perfect, but close enough. I told myself the problem was probably over. 3 days later, it happened again. This time the sound woke me instantly. The same heavy crunch ripped through the quiet night, followed by the deep rumble of an engine speeding away. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the window. But by the time I pulled the curtain aside, the street was empty. Whoever did it was already gone. When I stepped outside, my stomach dropped even harder than before. The same section of hedge was destroyed again. Fresh tire tracks carved through the soil like claws, tearing up everything I had just repaired. That's when the situation started to feel less like an accident and more like a message. The next morning I received my first letter from the HOA. It was tucked neatly into my mailbox like it had been delivered with purpose. Inside was a printed notice stating that my hedge violated community guidelines for landscape placement near roadway access. According to the letter, I had 7 days to correct the issue or face a fine. I read the letter twice, trying to understand how a hedge that had been there for years suddenly became a violation. I checked the rulebook they had sent when I moved in. The guidelines mentioned nothing about bushes being too close to the street. Yet somehow I was now being threatened with a fine. By the end of the week, another letter arrived. This one was harsher. The hedge still hadn't been moved, so the HOA added a penalty fee to my account. I felt a slow burn building in my chest. At the same time, neighbors started acting strange when I asked if they had seen anything at night. Most shrugged and said they didn't notice anything. One guy across the street gave a quick answer and then changed the subject like he didn't want to be involved. Meanwhile, the tire tracks kept appearing. Not every night, but often enough to make it clear someone was doing this on purpose. They always hit the same spot. Always late at night when the street was quiet. That's when the thought finally settled in my mind. Someone wasn't just damaging my yard. They were trying to make living here difficult enough that I would eventually give up and move the hedge. Or maybe even leave altogether. By the third time it happened, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The hedge had been repaired again, and once again it was crushed in the exact same spot. The tire tracks were so clear this time that you could follow them from the street straight through the bushes and back out again. Whoever was doing it wasn't hiding the damage. In fact, it almost felt like they wanted me to see it. I stood in my yard that morning staring at the ruined branches, trying to keep my temper under control. For a long time, I had been the kind of person who avoided conflict. I worked hard, paid my bills, and kept to myself. The last thing I wanted was a war with the HOA or some neighbor with too much time and power on their hands. But every crushed branch felt like someone was testing how far they could push me. The next letter from the HOA arrived that afternoon. This one wasn't just a warning. It was a formal violation notice. According to the document, my hedge was now considered a safety obstruction. The letter demanded that I remove it completely within 5 days or face escalating fines and possible legal action. The wording was cold and official, like the decision had already been made before I even read the first sentence. That night I sat in my garage thinking about everything that had happened. The repeated damage, the sudden rule violations, the silence from neighbors who clearly knew more than they were saying. The more I thought about it, the more obvious the answer became. Someone connected to the HOA wanted that hedge gone, and they were willing to make my life miserable until I removed it myself. I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired of being pushed. If the hedge kept getting destroyed by a car, then the problem wasn't the hedge. The problem was the car. So I decided to make a small change to the way the hedge was planted. Nothing illegal. Nothing dangerous to a person. I simply reinforced the ground underneath. I dug deeper around the base of the bushes and installed thick steel stakes beneath the soil, anchoring them firmly into concrete. Once the dirt was packed back over the top, the hedge looked exactly the same as before. Just a normal row of green shrubs along the edge of my yard. But underneath, it was no longer something a vehicle could simply drive through. 3 nights later, at around 2 in the morning, I heard the engine again. That night I was already awake when the sound came. After weeks of broken branches and warning letters, sleep had become light and restless. Every small noise from the street pulled my attention toward the window. When the low hum of an engine crept into the quiet neighborhood around 2 in the morning, I knew exactly what it was before I even stood up. I moved slowly to the front window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see the street. A dark SUV rolled down the road with its headlights off, creeping forward like someone who didn't want to be noticed. The vehicle slowed right in front of my house and paused near the hedge, almost like the driver was lining up the same path they had taken before. For a moment, everything was completely still. Then the engine suddenly roared. The SUV lunged forward straight toward the hedge, just like the other times. But this time, the sound that followed was completely different. Instead of the familiar crunch of bushes snapping, there was a violent metallic crash that echoed down the entire street. The front of the SUV slammed into the reinforced hedge and stopped instantly, the impact folding the hood upward like paper. Steam hissed from the engine as the vehicle sat there, stuck and damaged. A few seconds later, the driver's door flew open and a woman stepped out, shouting angrily into the night. Even from the porch light, I could recognize her immediately. It was Linda Carrington, the head of the HOA committee. Around the neighborhood, she had a reputation for walking around with a clipboard, writing violation notices for everything from mailbox colors to grass height. Now she stood in front of my yard staring at her wrecked SUV like it had betrayed her. I stepped outside onto my porch calmly, folding my arms as I looked at the scene. When she noticed me, her face turned bright red with anger. "What did you do to that hedge?" she shouted. I raised an eyebrow and looked at the bushes. "Nothing," I replied evenly. "They were just planted firmly. She looked back at the crushed front end of her SUV and then at the hedge again, clearly realizing what had happened. The car hadn't destroyed the bushes this time. The bushes had stopped the car. For the first time since this whole situation started, the balance of control had shifted. The person who had been quietly causing damage in the dark was now standing in the street with a broken vehicle and nowhere to hide. For a few long seconds, neither of us said anything. The quiet street, the steam rising from the crushed front of the SUV, and the broken silence of the early morning made the whole moment feel unreal. Linda stood there staring at the damage like her brain was struggling to accept what had just happened. For weeks she had been the one in control, sending warnings, issuing fines, and quietly destroying something that mattered to me. Now the situation had flipped, and she didn't know how to handle it. "You did this on purpose," she finally snapped, pointing at the hedge like it had personally offended her. I shook my head slowly. "No," I said calmly. "I planted a hedge on my property. Same hedge that has been here for years." Her anger only grew stronger. She started talking about HOA authority, neighborhood safety rules, and how this situation was going to cost me. But the louder she talked, the less power her words seemed to have. The evidence was sitting right in front of both of us. Her SUV wasn't on the road. It was halfway inside my yard, exactly where it had no business being. Within 15 minutes, the flashing lights of a police cruiser appeared at the end of the street. A neighbor must have heard the crash and called it in. When the officer stepped out and looked at the scene, it didn't take long for him to understand what had happened. He asked a few simple questions, checked the position of the vehicle, and walked along the tire tracks leading straight from the road into my hedge. Linda tried to explain that the hedge was dangerous and improperly placed, but the officer simply pointed to the property line and then back to the crushed SUV. "Ma'am," he said calmly. "This vehicle left the roadway and entered private property." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. The next few weeks were quiet for the first time in months. The HOA letters stopped coming. The complaints disappeared. And the same neighbors who had ignored the problem before suddenly started greeting me with friendly waves again. What I learned from the whole situation was simple. Some people mistake silence for weakness. They believe that if someone is calm and keeps to themselves, they can be pushed around without consequences. But sometimes all it takes is standing your ground quietly, firmly, and without backing down for the truth to show itself. And once it does, even the loudest bullies suddenly have nothing left to say. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real-life HOA drama and satisfying neighborhood justice, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for the next one. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more HOA drama stories.